Yes.
Dear Madam President, thank you for your time. And the first question would be around, what do you think, what's the situation in Africa? Because the fear is that is in everyone. There is no testing because of the lack of economical situation. And also it's affecting testing, and there is no facts how many really affected people are in Africa.
Thank you again, Roshan, for carrying out this meeting. Funnily enough, when we look at Africa, Africa is such a huge continent. In terms of region, we've seen that South Africa, for example, has eased up the lockdown and people now can go out. And I think throughout the continent, we haven't seen that many cases of infection. Now, as you have said, as we have also been saying, is it because of lack of testing, or is it because it's not affecting people that much? So we don't know. But I think throughout the continent, I think they have reported something like 40,000 cases, which is not a lot. I mean, relatively speaking, when you compare to countries like Italy, even Russia now, as it's happening. So let us hope that the progression stops and the continent comes out stronger and better for it.
Recently, you had an interview. You gave an interview about importance of the elevation debts of the poor countries, because these countries are mostly affected and they will not be able to recover themselves. How you see that it's going to happen?
Poor countries, usually the health infrastructure is very weak. And then you have the economical situation of these poor countries when people are asked to stay home. Now, when they are asked to stay home, how do they get access to food? How do they get access to all the basic necessities? So the problem are manifold when countries are poorer. The infrastructure isn't there. Poor people, when they are stuck home, very often social distancing is an issue. Access to sanitizing an issue, but I think more importantly, access to food is an issue. So some people in poor countries are even saying, we will not die of coronavirus, we'll die of hunger. And so this is the most tragic part of this whole thing, because to me, and I think to most people, food is a basic human right. And so these are issues that I think when we come out of this pandemic, we'll have to really start thinking very, very seriously how we can convince governments and how we can convince institutions to start investing in basic primary healthcare. I mean, if you look at what happened with Ebola in Western Africa, it boiled down to the fact that if they had just soap and running water, they could have prevented so many deaths. So these are things that I think will come back on the table after this pandemic, to see how government can be encouraged to fund and to invest in basic primary healthcare.
So there is one thing, like if we look, because coronavirus, COVID-19 is a new threat, or like, new kind of threats towards the world. But why we are lacking to use at least half of the amount of the money which we are using to the military troops or military equipments, industry, but not to our health system? Because it shows that with the biggest economy and with the biggest military troops like US, you are going to be the most affected. But health system is really important.
Again, I think you've touched on something very, very vital there, Roshan, is that it's a question of leadership. And we have seen enlightened leadership. And I think we have seen that in many countries in Asia that have come out. We have seen that even in countries like New Zealand. In fact, this morning, the Prime Minister said that there is no active cases at all in New Zealand. I think it goes beyond just the spending. Granted that health system has to be capitalized, but I think it comes down also to the leadership. And if you look at the case study, if we take New Zealand as a case study, we found that the Prime Minister has acted very fast and very early. Right from the very beginning, she closed down the frontiers, and she she actually carried out massive testing, and we see the result we are seeing today. So it is leadership. Then the health system has to respond. We have seen, for example, how the narrative of the Chancellor of Germany, because she's a scientist, the way she has tackled the problem, bringing the scientific approach to everything. So this is, again, the kind of narrative that we need to actually put out in the case of this pandemic. But I think also, as we have said, we have discussed, is the state of preparedness of our health system. And this is where many countries, we've seen, for example, many African countries, in fact, many Western countries do not even have sufficient number of ventilators. How do you actually tackle a problem like this if your institution, if your health system, it doesn't have preparedness? So, and of course, then the question will come back to on the table, I'm sure. How much do you put in the military, and how much do you put in looking after your population? So these are decisions that have to be taken, I think, at the level of nations, and I think at the level of multilateral institutions as well, who are helping out these countries. So these are discussions that need to be had. We need to have this as we progress in the course of 2020 and of course and beyond, for a proper reflection and put our money where our mouth is, because I think the health of the population should matter and should be a priority for any government.
Your response, created two questions, interesting questions. How it's possible, the countries where there is a female leaders, like Norway, Germany, and New Zealand, there is a less coronavirus cases and the less effects of the coronavirus than other countries.
Well, it's interesting that we have seen better results. And I think this boils down to something that we have been hammering, if I may use the word, for many years, to give the woman her chance. Leadership from a female perspective is definitely very different to what we have seen so far. And how come they have been different is that we have seen, for example, Angela Merkel bringing in, because she's herself a scientist, so she knows how important the science is in this matter. She has brought in, for example, the top scientists, the doctors, and she has shaped her decision based on the science. And I think if you look at, for example, the way Jacinda Ardern has been performing, she has communicated. She has shown empathy, and also the way she has tackled the deaths, it was not just purely statistics. And she drew lessons from there, and she actually brought the statistics and showed a meaning, showed empathy, showed caring, and she was very compassionate about it. So these are, I think, what define female leadership as opposed to male leadership, where again, we see more aggressive behavior. Female leadership, we tend to be more pastoral and more caring, and we look at the entire team and we shape the decisions, not on hubris, but on strong, solid scientific facts.
That's definitely, even former leaders, female leaders like you, like Helen Clark and Vaidevika Freiberg and many others, you took a really leadership role, because on social media and also on newspapers and on the news interviews, you've been always promoting the ways how it's possible and the way how it should be done. Much better than the male leaders. When it coming to the multilateral organizations, today we have seen one thing, that multilateral organizations failed up, because number one issue, we are attacking good or bad World Health Organization, and also United Nations failed up to call for the UN Security Council meeting. And as you said, it's almost since 1918, it's the biggest disaster, which we're facing. The UN Security Council couldn't be able to have a meeting and to have a common resolution. That's unbelievable something.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think this has been raised in many fora that, in 2005, 2003, 2004, when we had the SARS pandemic, I think the UN moved very fast. And when there was the Ebola crisis, the UN also moved very fast and declared it pandemic, and also they took the decision at the UN Security Council. Unfortunately, we didn't see that in the case of the coronavirus and the COVID-19. And I think this was, I think, a mistake, in my personal view, that we should have, taken that decision then. Having said this, there has been a lot of attack on institutions like WHO. In fact, we've seen that the US has even cancelled the funding. This was a very unique virus, because we have seen that it's never happened before. We never seen that before. So since January, I think the entire world, the entire health sector has been fumbling, because they were in front of a new beast and they had no idea of how to go about it. I don't think we should go into the blame game right now. I think right now we should address the crisis. And after that, we should be looking at, if we have to apportion blame, I think it should come afterwards. But definitely not taking that decision at the UN Security Council, I think has actually impacted on what we're seeing today. And, we can't put the clock back, but definitely if we had taken a decision, maybe things would have been different. But I don't think right now is the time to go into blame game. But having said this, again, I'll put my Africa hat. When you look at the UN Security Council decisions, and of course, whenever the items on the agenda, we find that over 70% of the agenda, of course, addresses African problems. So, and that yet there is no African representative on the US Security Council. I mean, this calls for reform, which I think many countries are clamoring for. But again, these are things that we have to address afterwards. Right now, we have to make sure that the world gets better. And this world, I think, after we have emerged from the COVID-19, I don't think we can go back to that normal that we've known in 2019, because I think there was already a problem with that normal. And I think the COVID has shown us what a clean environment looks like and what it should look like. And, we've seen, for example, how the air has become pure. We have seen blue sky in countries like India and China. So I think if there is any lesson to be drawn from the COVID, the lesson is that we can't compromise on our environment. We need to do something about this, and we need to move fast, because our future, the future of our generation, of our children, depend on the decisions we're going to take from now on.
Madam President, you are a scientist, and taking into consideration, like as a scientist, how you see, the current situation, because we see there is some discussions that Earth is trying to recover itself with the COVID, and it's trying to clean up the air. And as you said, India hasn't seen for the last 100 years as clean air, which I have been there recently before the pandemic, and it was unbelievable that you can't breathe. And China and many other countries, and rivers started in Florence, you have seen dolphins coming. But how it's going to, when we are going to come back to the normal life, how it's going to accumulate, or how we're going to face up the new challenges?
I think for far too long, we have taken nature for granted. And if you look at I'll just open a parenthesis here to actually make a correlation between the cities that were highly polluted, and you see the transmission and the number of patients, and of course the number of deaths that have happened. So there has been a few hypotheses put forward that the COVID has been traveling on the dust and on the pollution in these very cities. So I think, if we are going to address the system as it is, we increasingly going to have to look at what we call climate justice, environmental justice, and also understand that whatever is happening from any part in the world, it can affect the other part of the world, because it's pointing us to how interconnected we are. We are all interconnected. And as I've said before, and I will say it again, We are one of the many species in this ecosystem in which we live in. We are the apex species by the fact that, we have evolved and we have an intelligence, we have whatever we have. But having said this, we are very much part of the ecosystem. And if you look at the transmission from this virus to human, I think it's telling us something very, very fundamental. We are getting too close to these animals. We are destroying their habitat, and we're moving very, very far into the forest. So what we have seen now is likely to happen if we don't take the necessary measures. And another thing that it is also pointing out is the way we have been handling climate change, because climate change is going to be another impactor. It's going to promote other pandemics of the sort we've had, even worse, maybe, we don't know. And we have already had preliminaries warning when we have seen, for example, the manifestation of the Zika virus. The